In the 1980s, scientists began noticing something really strange in rivers. They were capturing male fish that were producing eggs. This was disrupting their normal spawning patterns, and the fish populations began to crash. Now, the cause wasn't a poison designed to kill fish. It turned out to be the synthetic estrogen, which is the same hormone that we use in human birth control. This was entering rivers through discharge from wastewater treatment facilities. Now, birth control, we know, has been profoundly beneficial to society. It allows people to make decisions about their bodies and their lives. Those same decisions we didn't realize was reshaping the biology of other species. In other species, nothing really dramatic happens. That same synthetic hormone just binds to a receptor. It's the same receptor it was designed to bind to in humans. But in fish, that tiny interaction triggered a cascade of effects that ultimately disrupted reproduction in male fish and collapsed the population. Now, I tell you this story because it captures the kind of work that I do. I study how these small, invisible interactions that occur at the molecular level grow into outcomes that reshape individuals, populations, communities, even ecosystems. And what surprised me over time wasn't the science, it was how closely these patterns mimicked and mirrored the way our own lives are shaped. So in ecotoxicology, we call this mapping of molecular responses all the way up to population and ecosystems and adverse outcome pathway. More broadly, this represents the concept that you may have heard of as One Health, which is the recognition that human health, animal health, and environmental health are inseparable. But you don't need to know these terms to understand the idea because you've lived them. Because outcomes do not stay where they begin, they travel. Now let me illustrate with another example. This example comes from a class of industrial chemicals that were designed to be extremely durable. They're known as PFAS, or you may know them as forever chemicals. They're found in nonstick coatings, waterproof clothing, firefighting foams, especially foams that were designed to put out fires fast. Firefighters need to save lives. Seconds mattered. These chemicals work. They were effective and they were life-saving. But because they were designed to be so stable, they didn't break down. And importantly, they also traveled. The same properties that made these chemicals so useful meant that they could travel through the environment. They traveled through water, through air, through food. Now, today, every single one of us has these chemicals in our bodies. Most people have never even heard of them, and they have serious health outcomes. Now, we all share this outcome, but we all got here through different pathways shaped by systems, decisions, histories we may never see. Some of us were exposed through our drinking water, some through our food, some through our jobs, most through decisions made decades before we were even born. Now, the fish didn't choose exposure to birth control. Firefighters don't choose exposure to chemicals. And communities don't choose persistence of these chemicals in their environment. But these outcomes still live on. They live in our bodies, our ecosystems, and our lives. I see this clearly when I'm working with farmers that have been affected with these chemicals. One farmer I worked with did everything right. He followed regulations. He did what was considered environmentally responsible practices. He applied treated biosolids to his land, and this was encouraged as sustainable recycling. Years later, PFAS was detected in his crops and in his soil and his water, not because of something that he did wrong, but because those chemicals had traveled through wastewater systems long before they had ever reached his land. The moment the test came back positive, everything stopped. His beef couldn't be sold, his crops were questioned. This centennial farm, built over generations, was suddenly reduced to a contamination report. Now, what struck me with this was not the chemistry, really. It was not so surprising, was how quickly the system narrowed its focus. The farmer became the problem, even though the pathways that brought those chemicals to his land extended far beyond him, across cities, industries, decades. This is what I mean when I talk about a failure of one. The outcome appeared in one place, even though the pathways that brought it to the farmer extended far beyond him. When complex systems fail, we often mistake the place where the failure appears as the cause, and we turn a systems problem into a failure of one. It shows up as shutdown instead of support, and blame instead of understanding. And this doesn't stop with fish or farmers. It shows up in our own lives too. When students are struggling academically, mentally, just trying to find their place, we often treat it as an individual failure without asking what processes, what expectations, what structures produce that outcome. The system quietly decides that the student is the problem. Seeing systems clearly doesn't mean nobody is responsible. And it doesn't mean that no one is to blame. It means resisting the urge to collapse a complicated story into a simple one. It means holding two truths at the same time, that birth control, improved human lives, but also reshaped ecosystems, that chemicals that were used in emergencies to save lives also cause long-term harm. When we live in the gray, we have to ask better questions instead of faster ones, such as, what system produced this outcome? Not who failed. Not who do we blame, but who needs to be at the table to solve this issue. Now, in nature, ecosystems work because different players play different roles. When predators disappear or pollinators vanish, the system can look stable for a while, but then, under stress, the system collapses. This is true for human systems as well. That farmer wasn't a failure of one because of something he did wrong. He was a failure of one because the system around him wasn't built yet. There was no coordinated advocacy to speak for him. There was no emergency funding to bridge the gap. There was no clear regulatory pathway. There were no education to guide the next steps and no research to help him adapt. And that's what had happened here. The system around the farmer hadn't been built yet. So the answer couldn't be, we need you to cope. We have to build the ecosystem needed to respond to it. So when the PFAS problem started showing up across Michigan in our drinking water, in our farms, and in our wildlife, it became pretty clear that this wasn't a problem that one group could hold. The chemistry matters, human health matters, agriculture matters, ecology matters, policy matters. What the Michigan government did next was really important. Instead of asking one agency to solve the issue or to handle it, they brought together multiple agencies, environment, health, agriculture, etc., to work as a coordinated system because the problem demanded it. Here at Michigan State University, we faced the same realization. Once we understood the scope of the PFAS problem, how it crossed drinking water, food, our bodies, ecosystems, it became clear that not a single lab or a single department could handle the whole issue. So we had to build something different. We weren't just studying a class of chemicals. We were rebuilding the ecosystem that was needed to respond to it. So we built a research center that brings together scientists, engineers, public health, veterinarians, extension educators, social scientists, together not to chase one answer, but to hold the problem together and look for solutions. And that shift from isolated expertise to shared responsibility changed the answers we looked for. Most importantly, that shift didn't magically solve the problem, but it did allow us to look for different solutions because we replaced isolation with connection. And importantly, that shift allowed for real solutions. It allowed for us to find ways to minimize exposure, restore livelihoods, and prevent the problem from reoccurring. Now, farmers are finding ways to keep farming in contaminated farms and safely by changing their practices to minimize exposure. Do you remember the fish? Wastewater systems are now adding treatment steps to remove pharmaceuticals before they ever reach rivers. And for students, living in the gray means staying open to people, to support, to curiosity, instead of turning struggle into isolation. And it also means learning to see the systems and the life cycles that are shaping your choices, rather than believing that every outcome begins and ends with you alone. This approach that we took for PFAS reflects the broader idea of One Health in practice. The most important lesson that I've learned from studying ecosystems is this: what often looks like a failure of one is just the visible endpoint of an invisible system. Many of the challenges that you're inheriting, environmental, social, institutional, aren't hard because you're failing to understand them. They're hard because they are genuinely complex. Seeing systems clearly doesn't remove responsibility, but it places it where it belongs, with the systems that we design, the decisions we make upstream, and the support that we build for people and fish downstream. When I talk about belonging, I don't mean fitting in or changing yourself to survive. I mean being understood as part of a system, not as a failure of one. I want to remind you that you are not alone inside these systems. We are shaped by many we may never meet. And learning to see those hidden connections helps us begin to care for the world we share and everybody else. Belonging becomes challenging in a world that insists on black and white thinking, good or bad, right or wrong. But when we learn to see complexity, when we recognize these unseen pathways connecting our lives, belonging becomes possible. Thank you.